Assalamu alaikum. Good morning, everyone. Greetings. Um, I'd like to greet you with the greetings of peace. My name is Dr. Gloria Bashir, and on behalf of Masjid Al Taqwa and resident Imam Tariq El Amin, as well as the Taleem committee that includes Dr. Lionel Allen and chaired by Dr. Aisha El Amin and myself, I again greet you with the greetings of peace. Assalamu alaikum. And we're going to begin our Taleem this afternoon with Al Fatiha. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, with Allah's name, the merciful benefactor, the merciful redeemer. Praise be to Allah, the cherisher and sustainer of the worlds, the merciful benefactor, the merciful redeemer, master of the day of judgment. Thee do we worship, and thine aid we seek. Show us the straight way, the ways of those on whom thou hast bestowed thy grace, those whose portion is not wrath and who go not astray. Ameen.
Amen.
So we continue with our June Health Awareness Month. And as I continue to take personal liberty with health awareness, we again are going to address a couple different topics during this month, including economic health awareness, social justice and community health awareness. And in today's print presenter is Brother Bill Chambers, who will present part 2 of his presentation on his journey to Al-Islam. And so we're gonna go ahead and get started. I just encourage you all to ask questions, to jump in where you feel that you have any pressing things that are of importance to you with regard to this topic. And so we're going to get started with Brother Bill.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Dr. Gloria. And I also want to thank the Taleem committee for allowing me to have 2 sessions to present my book, The Muslim American Fight for Social Justice, From Civil Rights to Black Lives Matter. Like I did last time, I'd like to start with a hadith from the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. This is from Bukhari. For every day in which the sun rises, there is a reward from God for those who establish justice among the people. So that's the topic of this book. Last time I did talk a lot about my journey to Al-Islam. You'll probably hear a little bit more about it today, but today what I'm really going to do is I'm going to remind you of the 2 conclusions that I came to in writing this book. And we're going to kind of expand on some of those and some of those issues that we didn't talk about last time. By the way, the book itself is available on Amazon. Actually, I think if you even search for it on Google, you can find it now. It's the paperback's like $20 and the electronic version's $10. And I did mention that anybody who bought the book from that last week Taleem session to today, I'm going to give all the revenue from the book to the renovation committee, renovation effort, I should say, that's going on at Masjid Al Taqwa in Chicago. So let's start with the 2 main conclusions that I made in writing this book and the research and the interviews and the work I did. The first one was that the Nation of Islam and the Imam W.D. Muhammad community of Al-Islam, that their true history has been distorted. And in many cases, I like to use the word redacted, which usually means that there were some of the more positive, the very important elements of the history that were just erased and not provided. And last time I talked a lot about how actually surprised I was by reading all the material. And there's been a lot, particularly academic material, published on the Nation of Islam. And like I said last week, none of it is very good. And the best things I read were ones that were written by people that were either in the Nation of Islam or were also members of the Imam David Muhammad community. So one of the most important things that how the history of the community has been distorted is this whole idea that the Nation of Islam is not a religion. It's a Black nationalist group, it's a cult, whatever. And unfortunately, I think some of those popular conceptions have also extended over the years to the Imam David Muhammad community. So we will be talking a little bit more about that. The second main conclusion was that the Nation of Islam and the Imam David Muhammad community really did serve as models of Muslim Americans fighting for social justice. And as I mentioned last time, in my view, just from the quote from the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, that fighting for social justice is a center core piece of what it means to be a Muslim. And it is the center of our deen. This whole idea that everybody needs to be treated equally and with equal dignity. And even I suggested last time with some things I'm not going to repeat this time, but from the Quran and the Sunnah and the Hadith, that as Muslims, we have an obligation to fight for social justice. And particularly in this case, which my book is mainly focused on, fighting against the institutional racism that's in the United States. So going back to the Nation of Islam, the Imam Muhammad community, how they, how their history is really a history of Muslim Americans doing this work and fighting for social justice. And they became really a model for a lot of the groups that came after them. And I'm going to spend a fair amount of time today talking about some of those groups. Now, some of them are the Inner City Muslim Action Network, Iman, that I know many of you know. But there's other groups like Muslims for Ferguson, Muslims for Social Justice, and the Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative, or Muslim Arc, that I'm a member of. And just so I don't forget about doing it this time, if you've seen the cover of the book, there's a painting of, it's actually from a photo of the Muslims for Social Justice. And I wanted to make sure I pointed out this time that the painting's from my artist wife, Elaine Fleming. So she's done a lot of other things, and she was also one of the editors of my book. So I want to make sure I mention that. Okay, so what we're going to do in this part two, I'm going to start, there's a lot of things that you can talk about, and I do talk about in the book, from the civil rights period up until, let's say, like 9/11 happened. But one of the best ways of doing that, there's a number of films that I talk about in the book, and I'm only going to cover a couple of them here. But one of the most important ones was this CBS documentary news analysis, which it really wasn't at all. It was really propaganda, but it was called The Hate That Hate Produced. So this was in 1959, and you all kind of think about what kind of environment we were all in 1959. I was about 9 years old, but this was presented by Mike Wallace, very important figure at the time for CBS News, and Louis LeMay. And it was all about, really, it became what the popular view of the Nation of Islam was at that time. And we'll hear in a moment, it's also a more sinister view about what the nation was about. But one of the things to remember is that, and sometimes I find myself mixing up the idea that, well, you know, it was the largest African-American Muslim organization in America at the time. Well, that's true, but it's also true it was the largest Muslim American organization in the United States at that time, because the large influx of immigrant Muslims, Arab and South Asian, and so on, that really didn't happen until 1965 when they loosened up a lot of the immigration laws. So it really was the largest American Muslim organization. So how this film proceeded was basically to attack the nation as this dangerous Black nationalist group. Now, the thing that's interesting about this, that's exactly the same view that the FBI held towards the nation. And I'm sure many of you know, and I cover this in my book, that the FBI was surveilling and trying to disrupt and do a whole number of other things all the way from the 1930s and targeting the Honorable Elijah Muhammad and every, whether we're talking about Malcolm X or like Shabazz and many of the other people that are part of the community. And I would suggest that that's still going on today. So if you really look at that, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later, this was really a propaganda film that presented to the American public, who at that time didn't know much about Muslims at all, that this was the FBI's view. I mean, this is what, they wanted everybody to believe. So when you get into the film, one of the other interesting things, they never mention the term Nation of Islam. The only person that does that is the Honorable Elijah Muhammad when they interview him later on in the movie or in the film. But the reporters continually call the group the Muslims. So as far as I know, and maybe somebody here can correct me, I don't think people in the nation ran around calling themselves the Muslims. And if you look in the film, well, they don't do that there either. Well, my belief is that that was intentional, because the idea was to, okay, here's this Nation of Islam group. They're the Muslims, which kind of suggested that this is all Muslims, right? So at the very beginning of the film, it doesn't take Mike Wallace very long to establish his theme. So at the very start, he says, this is a study of the rise of Black racism. After the film, there will be 5 people who will talk about what we can do about this rise of Negro racism. This is a gospel of hate that would set off a federal investigation if preached by Southern whites. Well, there's a whole number of things that are, well, both repulsive and also rather ironic, because there is a federal investigation going on in the Nation of Islam. The FBI was conducting it during this whole time. So his kind of suggestion that, oh, this gospel of hate, and if it was whites doing that, okay, that was all, BS. So that it continues on, and there's a statement of Malcolm X that's played in the background. And the statement says, you probably remember this one, it's, I charge the white man with being the greatest rapist on earth. I charge the white man with being the greatest murderer on earth. I call for the indictment of the guilty. So while this is going on, Wallace again describes the nation as homegrown Negro Muslims who call themselves the Muslims. They have the trappings of Islam, but regular Muslims won't accept them. The clothes they wear are in sharp contrast to American dress. They are Black nationalists. Well, there's a couple things to say about this. So the audience at the time, and if I was watching this when I was 9 years old or whatever, I had no idea what Muslims were. I mean, most people didn't. So this whole idea that, well, there's these other Muslims out there and they don't accept people in the nation, you would have no idea, like, okay, why don't they accept them? And the other thing about this clothes they wear is in sharp contrast to American dress. Well, if you look at Mike Wallace in the film, he's got a dark suit, nice shoes, a white shirt, a kind of skinny black tie. Now he's not wearing a fedora, but it's at least about men in the Nation of Islam. They look just like Mike Wallace is dressed. So how is this, the clothes they wear are in sharp contrast? Well, not really. So again, you can kind of see this propaganda they're kind of building up, and you get the suggestion that these are not real Muslims. The real Muslims are over there somewhere that we don't know anything about. And that it starts to lay the groundwork for this concept that this is not a religion. They're not part of any religion. They're just a Black nationalist group that teaches hate. So at that time, if you look at let me move on to this other point. They the first time you see the Honorable Elijah Muhammad interviewed or talked about, they say that let me go to this point here. Yeah, so the initial fact that they mention about him is that he was arrested for evasion and draft dodging during World War II. Okay, so there's nothing about that being because of his religious principles. And the impression, of course, you get, it was like, well, he didn't want to serve in World War II. He's some unpatriotic, un-American, and that's, again, what they intended to portray. And the first time you hear his voice, he says, he talks about rejecting Christianity. And he says, the Christian religion has failed you. The government of the United States has failed you. Well, there's, and I mentioned this last time, there's a book by Ghani Hassari. It's called The History of Islam in America. And he talks about this idea that there's this civil religion in America. And the parts of that religion are being white, they're being Christian. And then the other part is that you're dedicated to these undefined democratic values. Doesn't really talk about what those are. Well, one of the things that this film is doing, and I would say continues to have an effect, it's clearly that the Nation of Islam, well, number one, they're Black, they're not Christian. We don't quite know what they are, but they're Black nationalists, and we're not sure about their democratic values. So they're kind of, as the Irish say, they're like, beyond the pale. Like they're some other group. The interview that they do with Malcolm X, the very first thing when they introduce him, and they describe him as a drug dealer convicted of robbery who now says he's a changed man. Well, I love that "now" in there, because it's this idea that, well, maybe he really isn't a changed man, and maybe he's still a drug dealer or a criminal or whatever. I mean, these are the very first things they say about some of the leaders in the Nation of Islam. And Malcolm makes a comment in there about how even the earliest African civilizations were reduced to servitude by colonization. And this has kind of continued on to today. Well, the reporter interprets that statement, and they always have someone make a statement, and then the reporters for the audience tell you what to believe. So in this case, the reporter says, well, the psychology of the Muslims is to drench the Negro in Black supremacy. Well, there's no historical context or whatever, but this is what you're supposed to believe. Now, the other interesting thing about the film in terms of propaganda and how it sets up this, the Nation of Islam, it's not only not part of Islam or they're not Muslims, but it's not really a religion, where there's none of the, like they call, trappings of Islam shown in the film. And I always try to imagine if they filmed one of the services the nation had, they would have been, let's say the Honorable Elijah Muhammad would have maybe been up there giving a sermon or a khutbah or a speech or whatever. He probably would have been reading from the Bible, maybe from the Quran. We might have seen people praying. They might have seen that big banner across the top, "There's no God but Allah." And if you're a Christian audience and you actually saw that, you might go, that looks a lot like church. And he's even reading from the Bible, or at least talking about it. Well, the reason that they didn't show any of that, they don't want you to think that it's a religion. That this is, this has nothing to do with a religion. So when there's this discussion about, like what the Honorable Elijah Muhammad said about this rejection of Christianity, the way they interpret it as, well, the failure of Christianity, it's a religion of enslavement that's preached by these groups, like including the nation. Well, how the reporter kind of interprets that is, he has this quote, there's a quote where he says, well, the American Negro has never forgotten that they became a slave and a Christian at the same time. Okay, well, there's a couple things that he left out of that discussion, that both of those things were by force. So if you remember from the last time when I talked about Sabine Diouf, the Servants of Allah, where she did a lot of research on that about 30% of the slaves that came to the Americas were from Muslim West Africa. And obviously these people were captured and put on slave ships. And then when they got to the United States, they were forced to become Christians. It's not like this was a choice. But of course, none of that is going to be reflected in this movie or in this film. Now, at the end of the film, they do interview some Black Christian leaders that they talk about. And some of you remember Representative Adam Clayton Powell. So he was one of the people who was interviewed. And one of the first things he said is, and this is where they're kind of the narrative that they're trying to, the producers of this film are trying to explain, kind of gets off track when they actually interview people. So Powell says, well, he acknowledged, Christianity in the US has been dragging its feet. There's more segregation on Sunday morning at 9 o'clock than at any other time, which of course, probably you've heard that phrase before. So, and then the next person they interview is this Dr. Hedgeman. He's a former administrative assistant to the New York mayor at the time, was Robert Wagner. And the whole question in this interview was supposed to be about, well, what extent does Christianity deserve to be called the religion of enslavement? It's like asking you, like, when did you stop beating your wife or something? I mean, it's just, the whole question is just already kind of twisted. And as they're interviewing him, he just gets more and more frustrated, and kind of in exasperation. At one point he says, well, Jesus may not have been Black, but he certainly wasn't white. So, based on like Dr. Hedgeman's comment that many Black Americans have become disillusioned with America. That's one of the comments he made. Well, the reporter once again steps in, so to make sure we understand how to take this comment. He says, we learned that a growing segment of the American population has become disillusioned with America. Tragic and irrefutable evidence that a segment of the Negro population is giving in to Black supremacy. Okay, so any kind of criticism, that this partly reminded me of Michelle Obama. And I don't know if you remember when she made that comment. She was a speech or something, and she said, "Well, you know what? Sometimes I'm not very proud of being an American." I mean, this kind of thing still continues on to today. So the final interview, they do have a long one with the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, but of course at this point they've set him up as leader of some Black nationalist group. And one of the points during the interview, the reporter asks him, "How is your God Allah manifested himself during this interview?" Well, again, the question is very interesting. It's your God, Allah. It's not it's not our God. We're all Christians, and we pray to this God over here. So you all pray to Allah, which, as everybody knows here, they're trying to make it look like, this isn't a religion. If they do pray to a God, it's nothing to do with our culture or our Christianity. So the last thing I wanted to talk about this particular film is that it was produced in a period of, definitely the height of Jim Crow laws. And that I mentioned about the FBI investigating groups. Well, the FBI was investigating every single Black group. It didn't matter whether it was a civil rights group or a faith-based group, the SCLC or SNCC. I mean, they were all on the list. And, they had Herbert Hoover had this list of like Black nationalist organizations. Well, it was pretty much any Black organization was suspicious, and they were wiretapping and following people around and having informers, and that was going on through this whole period. And then, which in my mind, again, as I explained in the book, this is just pure racism. I mean, this is part of the institutional racism that's part of the American fabric that was making this happen. And then during the post 9/11 period, we'll see with that racism that had been going on, for the beginning of the country's founding, then becomes merged with Islamophobia. That after 9/11, all Muslims were suspect and were kind of treated in a racist way, whether they were Arabs or South Asians or whatever they were. Now, I'm gonna, there's a longer history that I talk about of the Nation of Islam under the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, under Minister Farrakhan. I do talk a lot about the transition to the Imam W.D. Muhammad community, and about W.D. Muhammad. And one of the things I said last time is that, like I said, there's no good history of the Nation of Islam, or really the especially the transition to the Imam W. Muhammad community. Like I said, often he's treated in these academic works as, well, he's the leader that brought the Nation of Islam to Orthodox Sunni Islam. And then they just kind of stop there. Well, as we all know, he was an amazing religious leader, one of the most important in the 20th century. And his view of the Quran and the Sunnah and that was very advanced and unique and all those things. So I do talk about that in the book. And one reason I'm not going to talk about it here is that, well, many of you know that kind of history, and you'll probably be able to kind of read through it. But this is also for, as I said last time too, the audience for this book isn't just our community here. It's really designed to educate non-Black Muslims and Muslims of any kind, and even non-Muslims that have been affected by the propaganda that, you know, we talked about with the hate that hate produced. So at this point, I'm going to mention a couple of other films, and then I want to move on to talking about the social justice groups. And all these films that I'm going to talk about have a very detailed analysis in the book, and it's kind of fun to look at the original film and then kind of read through some of this. The one I'm going to talk about now, and just so you know, I use these films to describe the current view or the popular view of Muslim Americans, particularly African Muslim Americans during that time. So the first one I'm going to talk about here is Roots. I think we probably all saw that in one way or another, and it was in 1977. At the time, it was the highest rated TV series in history. And it really did have a big impact. And I would say, you know, I remember watching it, and one of the things, it was one of the first series, and there's been a number since then, that really showed how terrible slavery was. I mean, that you could watch this on TV and how people were captured and sent over in the boats and how they were treated. It also was one of the first films that showed what Sylvian Doof talked about, was that many of the slave revolts, or many of the slaves who resisted slavery were Muslims. Because often, and again, this isn't 100% or whatever, but often the people that were leaders were Muslims because they tended to be better educated, you know, because we know West African civilization was very advanced. I mean, it had hundreds of years of Muslim civilization. So that idea that they showed that in Roots, that some of these people were resisting, you know, for Muslim white America, this was like, really? So it did have a big impact. Now, I'm not going to go into the analysis more than to say, hopefully you figured out, and I certainly had no idea at the time or until I watched this again, that Kunta Kinte was Muslim. Now, there's all kinds of little indications, and I did watch the whole thing again, of that Kunta Kinte was Muslim. He came from a Muslim community, and there's images of him saying Al-Fatiha and him praying.
How you doing, Sandy?
Just fine.
And folks might want to mute themselves a little bit. Yeah, so I'll keep going.
Please, can everyone mute yourselves? Thank you very much.
Okay. Yeah, so there's a lot of indications. In fact, there's even one where another Muslim who's trying to get Kunta Kinte to run away from the plantation. And, you know, they greet each other with salams, and he's trying to convince him to leave, but Kunta Kinte doesn't want to because his family's there. And so all of this is in there. But at that time, again, most people had no idea that there were Muslims. And I would say there's one person, he was one of the slavers running the slave ships. And he talks about how, yeah, you know, all these slaves, and I forget whatever word he used, but, you know, they're like just worshiping their African gods, and, you know, and their tribal gods. But, you know, and then once, of course, they come to America, you know, they become Christians, which was partly the whole idea of what reinforced slavery. So there is a little bit of that in this film, but the main audience would not have picked that up. I mean, they just wouldn't have noticed that that was the case. So there's still this idea that, you know, Islam's not really a religion. You know, if you're African American, Muslim, there's something suspicious about that, or it's not really a religion at all. So I'm going to move more to the 1990 to the 2000s kind of period. And that's what you'll see in my book. I divide it into different periods of time and try to talk about what's going on there and how Muslim Americans are considered or looked at. The film that's in that period, 1992, is Malcolm X. And I love that film a lot. And I thought that was great. And it was actually a very important film because it was the first one that was a positive portrayal of an African-American Muslim leader. So we hadn't ever seen that before. But how he was presented, Spike Lee or not, was as a Black nationalist leader. And the parts of the history where, Haj Malik el-Shabazz created his own, when he broke away from the Nation of Islam and tried to create his own Muslim organization, that's hardly treated at all. And of course, we know about him going on Hajj, and that's talked about to some extent, but it's treated as if, well, he was in this Nation of Islam group, and then he broke away and somehow came to what the real Islam is all about. And there's some suggestion that he, spent time obviously on Hajj, but that's not really emphasized very much. So even in this movie, there's still that idea that, well, he's really a Black nationalist leader. And that's how I think from a popular culture point of view, that's how I saw him. I mean, I wasn't Muslim back then. So one of the things that, and I'm going to suggest this book that I came across in the research that I did for this, that if you really want to read a really good piece on the later part of his life, there's a book called Malcolm X at the Oxford Union. It's Racial Politics in the Global Era, and it does an analysis of when he was invited to Oxford, their debating society. And if you read his speech, he talks about being Muslim over and over and over again, and how these are the principles of Islam that he's debating and talking about here. And he has very much of a global view. He talks a lot about, like at the time, the Belgian Congo, there was a civil war. Well, it wasn't a civil war. It was the Congolese trying to overthrow the colonial powers who were running the country. And Malcolm X, he talks about, the French and the British and the US bombing villages and killing civilians. And he even makes this comment about, it seems like obviously Black lives don't really matter very much, obviously. So, and he did a whole, and many of you probably know this, I mean, he did a whole tour, and he was trying to get the United States to be put in front of the UN for violating human rights. Well, that might have been a good thing to talk about in this movie, but again, that didn't fit with the presentation that they wanted to do. The last film I'm going to talk about, and I can talk about it a lot because it's a terrible movie. I don't know if anybody remembers Ali from 2001. It was a film of Will Smith, was Muhammad Ali. It was released like just 3 months after 9/11. So I don't think anybody was too interested in hearing about Muslims after 9/11 in the movie, but it was a really terrible movie. I mean, as far as they were concerned, he was a world champ, and he was chased women, and they didn't show him really having much to do with the Nation of Islam or what the Nation of Islam was all about. He didn't want to serve in Vietnam, but they don't explain why that is, just like with the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. So I don't want to say anything more about it. The thing that strikes me is that I always kind of wondered, Muhammad Ali certainly became a global figure, someone that everybody respected. But often, that was because of the work he was doing, but people didn't really have it in their head that, and I'm talking about popular culture here in the United States, that he was a Muslim. And I always remember watching his janazah that they had in Louisville. And I kept thinking, boy, I bet there's a lot of people like watching this going, oh, Muhammad Ali was a Muslim and they're having a janazah service. And I'm kind of thinking they were probably surprised by that. But and a few minutes now that, so I make sure I leave some time for questions. I do want to talk about these various groups that kind of came after the Nation of Islam and the Imam our community. And I mentioned the first one, and this is all like 1999 up to the present, was Imam in the Inner City Muslim Action Network. And I think a lot of you know the tremendous work they do. I think they're celebrating their 25th year this year, and they were founded like 4 years before 9/11. So, and they were really one of the first group that everything they do, it's all about being Muslims and fighting for social justice in all kinds of different areas. And you know how successful they've been. Now they have a group in Atlanta. And it was also one of the first groups that combined a lot of different Muslim groups. Rami's, Palestinian. I know there's other Arab Muslims that are there. There's I know people from the Nation of Islam have worked there. So if you think about, and this is going to be true for all the groups from now on, very diverse, from every area, every cultural background and everything of the Muslim American community. The one I wanted to talk about, and they're the ones that are pictured on the front, Muslims for Social Justice. They were founded in 2013. They're in North Carolina. And the thing that's interesting about them is when they talk about social justice, they're also a anti-colonial, anti-Islamophobia. They support Black liberation movements. They're anti-racism, anti-sexism. So they have a really broad view of the social justice groups that they're fighting with or working with. And they're one of the few groups that are part of like very large coalitions. So there's a coalition called the Movement to End Racism and Islamophobia that they work with in that particular area. And there's another very big group called Project South. That's a huge coalition of all kinds of different organizations. That started in Atlanta. There's an Institute for the Elimination of Poverty and Genocide. Maybe some of you might know about them. So this group does campaigns with all these different organizations. And Mansour Chima, he's one of my friends that interviewed one of the founders. And if you read through his interview, the other thing that's interesting about that, about founding of this group, so he was an organizer for this Project South. One of the other people who helped found it, somebody named Saladin Mohammed, he was part of the United Electrical Workers Union, which at that time in North Carolina, that was the largest Black union in the whole state. And one of the other unions, in talking to Mansour, the transit union in the same area, people that ran the buses and the trains and everything else, that was also a majority Black union. So this particular group kind of grew out of not only Muslims, but also activists and people, union organizers and that type of thing. So it really reflects the kind of work that they do and that they still do. The last two, one's Muslims for Ferguson, and then I'll talk briefly about the Muslims Anti-Racism Collaborative. Now, the Muslims for Ferguson, they're the first example of like an ad hoc group. So something, obviously, the shooting and murder of Michael Brown by the police in Ferguson in 2014, that led to a whole number of different Muslim leaders from across the country to get together and say, you know, we, as a Muslim community, we have to do something about this. And it's the first kind of view of what I would call like a Muslim American Ummah, you know, of activists that, like, for example, I think many of you know Dawood Walid. He's head of executive director of CARE in Michigan. He's written 4 or 5 terrific books, which you should take a look at. So he was one of the people that founded this. There's a Mohammed Malik. He's a Muslim activist in the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition. There's Linda Sarsour. Many of you probably know her. She's a leader in New York. So all these people got together and they started to organize. We used to call them teach-ins, but organize events like in mosques or community centers, either where they were, like in Dearborn or wherever, or to get people to go down to Ferguson and support the marchers and people in Ferguson. And when I interviewed Dawood Walid, and I re-interviewed him again not too long ago, this was one of the times where there was a lot of pushback, like from some of the immigrants in that area about, well, you know, the immigrant Muslims, there's too much fighting and too much violence and property destruction and stuff like that. So that was one of the, and he was kind of talking about there's still some difficulties of that now. So I'm just going to finish with just the Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative. So looks like I might have gone over a little bit. You might be familiar with them. The CIGC tried to have them do some anti-racism workshops about a couple of years ago. And their organization, they're also a virtual organization, and their whole focus is on doing anti-racism training. And they were also founded by Dawood Walid was involved in their founding, and some other people that they got sick of, like, white and South Asian Muslims calling Black Muslims Abid, which is kind of an Arabic slur for Black people. It means slave. So they started getting more active and finding people that wanted to fight racism in the community. So they kind of formed together, and they're also a very virtual organization. There's people from all across the country. So the only thing that I was going to do, and maybe it might be better just to leave the time for questions, I was going to do some kind of conclusions of my work here, but I think it might be a good time. Yeah.
I have a quick question for you, and I know
Sure.
Imam Tariq on, and he might have some kind of questions for you. But I have one quick question, and as you've talked about your activism that started many, many years ago, long before you became Muslim, and, you know, your broader activism with the Palestinians and with the Irish Republic and with just social justice broadly, right? Now, how did all of your activism intersect with your relationships with your family?
Okay.
Your journey.
Yeah. So the quick answer to that is most of my activism before I became Muslim my family kind of knew about it, but they, when I was an undergraduate, they didn't really, I didn't talk about it that much because my father was one of these people that if he heard too much about it, he was paying for my education at Northwestern University. And there was a couple times I almost got arrested, and I'm thinking, yeah, if that happens, he's just gonna cut everything off. So I was one of those people that I was very active, going to all these places, but I didn't tell them about it. So as far as my family was concerned, Bill was always going off in these various directions, and they knew I was liberal, but they didn't have a lot of detail about what I was doing. And that's been pretty much true with the Palestinian and Irish Republican kind of activism I did. So the only point that they actually got interested, of course, was when I said, well, I'm becoming a Muslim. And I've had a lot of, at your wonderful wedding shower that we were at, I know many people here were at yesterday. I was talking about how, let's see, I have a brother-in-law who's a militant atheist, and a sister-in-law who thought I was going to make Elaine wear a hijab, and even recently my sister.
Okay, have a nice one.
Take care.
Yeah, my sister is also. She wasn't too fond of the book I was writing. She's very Catholic. So they, between activism and being, it was obviously somehow worse being a Muslim, I guess. So they kind of tolerate me, I guess. It's the best way to put it.
Okay, we have a hand up for from Bashir Assad. You've got the floor. Oh, we've got a few hands up. Bashir Assad, you've got the floor. You can unmute yourself. And there's one from Dr.
Am I muted now?
Yes, you are unmuted. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Like what's
Yeah, Bill and I were together yesterday, so I'm familiar with the conversation. But I'd like to make a comment. Maybe it'll come into the question. But listening to your presentation today and this area of justice that the book focused on, and the movies that you mentioned and the hate that hate produced, I think what is significant too is, we were talking about Wallace and his hate produced, and the things that he was referring to that particular movement about. I think was very significant is some of those things had some relevancy. Some of those things didn't. But with Imam Wardi Muhammad, when he came into office, one of the things that he recognized these things, these schemes and strategies that were working against us. And he strategically argued and brought things into order where they could not come at us with those kind of false accusations. Some of them may have been true, that we were not in the correct posture, I'll say, of al-Islam. So he corrected those. He recognized those things. He corrected those things, and he put us in a position where we could not be attacked by those things, those schemes that they were coming against us with. And one other thing I like to point out too, when we talk about justice in the Nation of Islam, and that was one of the focuses, or they tried to portray us as a hate group. Our motto was freedom, justice, and equality for African American people. And one of the main aspects of the Nation of Islam too is that we obeyed the law, but we were seeking justice for the injustices that had been put upon us by this system. And this program could go long. I could have a lot more comments on this situation. I know my brother G. Bilal is on also. I see him on, and I know he could make some very good commentary on this situation. But this is a more, and I'm grateful for your book. But this is even a more involved situation. If we would really get into it, the schemes that were put on against us. And again, looking at the strategic planning and implementation by Imam Wardi Muhammad to thwart, to avoid these schemes that came after. So that's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Good
Thanks,
comment.
Brother Bashir.
So we've got another couple questions or comments. We got Dr.
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum assalam.
I am so happy to hear you speak on your book. I've been blessed with early reading of the book, and I found it scholarly, insightful, and well-researched. And I think the book occupies a space that really hadn't been filled before. And as you occupy a space also, a very special space, I think you reflect how the course and the journey that we've taken or have been taking is viewed by the popular culture. And that's very important for us to have that perspective. And I think you bring that perspective, as well as a certain objectivity, friendly objectivity. Even when we've had objectivity in the past, we could see that it was tinged and unfriendly. But you bring a friendly objectivity, and I find that refreshing. And what it did for me too, is Imam Muhammad described his father, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, as a social reformer. Okay, social. And we know from the earliest description of the Nation of Islam, it was freedom, justice, and equality. So we have social justice, and we are called on to relieve oppression and injustice in the Quran. So it's a particular perspective that you bring all of that together in the book, and link it in a historical narrative. And I think that's very good. And see, in having gone over that course for the past 60 years that I've been blessed to be a member of this community, I didn't look at it as a social justice endeavor, but basically dawah and fishing and dawah. And I figured all of that was entailed in that. But to bring it in the way that you did or have done, I think gives us the links to the other individuals that are involved in the same work. And having come through the nation, even as a young man, you know, I saw the civil rights movement is over there, and I saw what we were doing was over here. You know, sometimes working against the best interests of our people, and sometimes working with it. But only with the insight that we obtained from the Imam that we see this as parallel movements. and I think that your book is in that line, showing the parallelism or the convergence. So I'm going to stop there because I could continue to talk. So just thank you for your book and thank you for your efforts. Assalamu alaikum.
I appreciate that, Dr. Ramadan.
We've got another hand up. Sister Bina, I'm getting some feedback. Maybe there's some place that's not in my face where it needs to be muted.
She's still on mute.
Oh, hello? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, now I can.
Yes, okay.
There you go.
Assalamu alaikum. How are you?
Good. Walaikum assalam. Thank you.
Alhamdulillah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this presentation this afternoon. I found immense benefit from it. One of the things that came to my mind was the intersectionality of different justice movements around the world. And and you talked about a couple of organizations, but I'm just even thinking about, you mentioned Ferguson, and I know that after the murder of Michael Brown, they had talked about how the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, had given training to the St. Louis Police Department, different police departments in this country.
That's exactly right.
There's also, and the Stand with Kashmir, an organization that does work for Kashmiri rights, has talked about how Israel has provided a large amount of weapons to India, which is also, oppressing occupied Kashmir. And who funds that? The U.S. government. So my point in all this is the oppression that we see in this country is the same, it's very similar. And so a lot of the strategies are very similar to what we're seeing around the world. And I think Angela Davis has spoken a lot about the importance of the intersectionality of all of our movements for liberation, for oppressed people here and around the world. And I'm just wondering which organizations you think are really have that mindset of really working against, structural racism in this country, and then linking it to how governments fund that here and around the world. And I hope that question makes sense, but that's what's been on my mind.
Yeah, well, I'll try to give you a quick answer. Everything you're talking about could probably easily be my next book, but as you probably gathered, because of my being involved and particularly in Palestine work for a very, very long time, and still am, that's one of the areas, even if you look at Black Lives Matter and the Palestinian movement, I mean, whether they were Muslims or just Arabs or whatever, there was all kinds of intersectionality and all kinds of different groups that were part of the whole Black Lives Matter movement. Most of the groups, I'd say now, are either focused on, there's the US Palestinian Community Network, does a lot of great work. There's Jewish Voice for Peace, which actually I'm a member of. They're a very brave group of Jewish fighters that are pro-Palestinian and really have done some amazing things and amazing organizing over the years. So most of the groups tend to be focused on either, they're focused on Palestine, or they're focused on, like I mentioned, the Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative, they're focused on anti-racism work. But when there's some larger issue or larger thing going on, then you find them all working together. There'll be, there's people protesting the war in Ukraine, or when Gaza has been attacked, there's all kinds of different organizations that have come together. And some of them are like the American Friends Service Committee does a lot of terrific work in that area. And there's some socialist groups in the United States, but most of them have been kind of sidelined. One of them, the Freedom Road Socialist Organization, is probably has one of the better analyses of things in terms of anti-racism and anti-sexism and kind of an international view. But that's about all. You know, like I said, I could probably write another book on that part of things. But that is a terrific thing that's happening now. Much better than when I was an activist in the 60s. There wasn't much intersectionality back in the late 60s, early 70s. So
Yes, thank you.
It's global right now, the way that
yes, absolutely global.
Yeah,
Yep.
global mindset.
Yes, thank you so much. Pardon me for it could be muted. But thank you, Sabina, for your comment, your question. And we've actually gone a few minutes over. And but I want to thank you, Brother Bill, for your insightful comments. I want to thank all of those who asked questions and made comments for your insightful comments as well, because that all contributes to our community growth learning. And as we all get to engage in how one another became there's a journey to Islam. So I want to thank you again, Brother Bill Chambers, for your presentation. And just lastly, again, those who purchase his book, all proceeds will be donated to the renovation for this weekend for Masjid al-Taqwa. So I want to
I did want to say one last quick thing. I also want to thank what I like to call my beloved community. I want to thank everyone on the line, everyone who's part of the Imam Nabi Muhammad community. It's definitely my home. And I wanted to share one comment that my wife Elaine and I were at that wonderful wedding shower at Dr. Rod and Dr. Gloria's house yesterday, and there was a lot of you were there. And when Elaine left, she said, "You know, I've never been around a warmer, more wonderful group of people. And if I ever thought about, you know, becoming Muslim, they would have convinced me just about how they were." So, yeah.
Oh, that is wonderful. We would welcome.
We had a wonderful time.
That compliment. So yes, thank you so very much, and that makes my heart warm. And so I thank you. And we've got a comment from Sister Bina who says that is true. So thank you, mashallah. So again, we've gone over a few minutes, so we're going to close out. But I want to thank you all for your participation and look forward to you next week as we conclude. We've got another comment. Thank you, Brother Bill. Just bought your book. This is from Sister the Anissa family, and they enjoyed your presentation. So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. We pray, oh Allah, that for the cover and protection of all those who are on this Zoom meeting, and our families, keeping us all healthy and safe, and continuing to ask, oh Allah, for your healing mercies and grace. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum, everyone.